Hello, everybody. Welcome to a series of dialogues on global history at Tokyo College. I'm Haneda Masashi, director of Tokyo College and the moderator of the whole series. Today, we have a special guest, Professor Jeremy Adelman. He is a Henry Charles Lee Professor at Princeton University in the United States and Director of Global History Lab in Princeton. He is one of the major figures in the fields of global history, not only in the US, but also in the world. And he has already published a lot of books related to world global history, Worlds Together, Worlds Apart, a textbook of world history published by Princeton University's press more than 2 decades ago, and keep selling. And also, we have been working together a lot between University of Tokyo and Princeton in collaboration. We have a very good relationship between me and Professor Adelman. And today's topic is the temporality. Professor Adelman wrote an article entitled What is Global History, just after the election of American president 4 years ago. And today we are just after the last election of American president in the middle of November, and we know who won the election. And we not only me, but also all of us want to know more what he's now thinking of the time we are living and what is the mission of global history in this contemporary world. And today, TERADA Yuki is with me at Tokyo College. She's a project researcher writing a doctoral thesis on the museum history in Iran, and she will ask Professor Adelman several questions on the temporality. Yuki, now it's your turn. Let's start.
Thank you for your introduction, and nice to see you, Professor Adelman. I have a few sets of questions, but the first, I want to ask you what is global history by your definition. But beforehand, because you published the article in 2017, and in that article, you already actually mentioned about the backlash of global history. So after a few years, how is it changed? What do you think the global history is now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, I have to ask myself the question almost every day. Our theme is temporality, and what that means is that historians, like many different kinds of intellectuals, are themselves the product of the times in which they live. And when you live in such a fevered, at least here in the United States, very angry, polarized world, you can't help but be affected by what's going on around it. This is something we can talk about. But your question is, what is global history? And of course, as we're thinking about temporality, one of the concessions we have to make is that global history has changed. And it is a very dynamic field. In some senses, like all historical inquiry, that is, each generation or each moment asks a fresh set of questions about the past according to how they live. For those of us who do global history, there's a special relevance or poignancy to this, which is that we live in a very fractured, complex, and very conflictual global age. So the narratives we have about the global past are often in dialogue with what we think about our global present. So it has changed, and I think one of the things we will talk about is what's happened to this field and what are the questions about the global that applied 4 years ago when we were seeing this tremendous wave of nationalism versus now. We'll get into that. But I do think that there are three common traits. And I know you've already talked to many of our friends and colleagues in this relationship that we have between Berlin and Paris and Princeton and Tokyo, which has really been so important for the collaboration. So you'll know that we share a couple of traits, and I would just say three very quick ones. One is that we try to write narratives that practice a methodology that one might say goes beyond methodological nationalism. That the stories that we tell about people are not stories from the inside of the nation out, but oftentimes from the outside in. The second, which is crucial, and I think we'll probably get to this, which is to go beyond Eurocentrism. And I think we'll talk about what Eurocentrism was, what Eurocentrism is, but in particular, when we try to go beyond Eurocentrism, it's really trying to challenge the traditional stories about modernization. And then the last one, so against methodological nationalism, against Eurocentrism, the last one is that we treat our systems as open systems, right? So that the units of study, even the nation itself, is affected by all kinds of outside forces. Well, what about now? I mean, it's worth remembering. So when I wrote that original essay, what is global history now? It was really in response to a set of events that had been gathering really since 2014, where you could really see the rise of political nationalisms of various sorts. With 2015, the response to the global migrant crisis, then Brexit, then of course the election of Donald Trump, and there were many other things at the same time. What was happening in Eastern Europe was very troubling. And I felt that many of us who were practitioners of global history, we were fixated on narratives that could not understand the backlash. And so I felt that we really needed to reckon with that and what the sources of the feeling of the anti-global sentiment of 2015, 2016 was. And so it was a reckoning with our own field, right? What's happened, of course, in the meantime is deglobalization. And we can talk about what that is, that we are much more attentive to breakdowns and fragility and the weaknesses of the global rather than assuming that the global is a kind of juggernaut or powerful. I would say now, and I think we may get to this in the conversation, I worry less about global history. In 2015, 2016, I worried about global history and global narratives. Now my concern is the power or the renationalization of our narratives. And
in terms of nationalism, following your discussion, it seems that before 2014, there was no nationalism in the United States, at least. Is it true? Because in case of Japan, we have been making a lot of nationalism throughout the whole last century, and it's still very strong. I mean, how is the situation in the US?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we were not as attentive or alert to the ways in which there was a debate happening because we were thinking in international terms. Our ears were not open to anxieties about the nation, but they were there. It is true that American public discourse has tended to be less obsessed with the national category for a variety of reasons we can talk about. But I would say really by Trump, Trump is the effect of a change that was happening, not the cause of a change. And what that means is that there were movements. There was a nativist strain, a lot of it around race, a lot of it around immigration, a lot of it about a fear of China. We can go down the list. And he captured that anxiety. And we, global historians, did not. And while I may dislike Mr. Trump, I have to say he woke us up, right? Well, so I would say in the United States, it was perhaps more of a shock than it would have been, say, in France or Italy, where the undercurrents of nationalism or the national question was always a much more prominent figure. Even in Britain, we can talk about that. So I think we have to now, I think 4 years ago, I think we had to reckon with the problems and the limits of global history. Now, I think we global historians have to critique the national history when it's dominating the intellectual and civic landscape.
But when you say like adapting to the present situation, but I think historians still have this dilemma to overcome the Eurocentric terms such as nation and nationalism and the framework. Yeah. So what do you think, is there any strategies to overcome this dilemma?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I mean, because one might say that, and some people would argue that the nation itself was a European concept that got exported. This is debated. There's lots of discussion.
Exported, but modified considerably in each country.
That's right. Each country had to adapt the category to suit. But what they shared was this idea of the nation as the repository of sovereignty. But there was immediately a problem, and this is something that Masashi and I have been talking about for many years. There was immediately a problem because in some respects, the creation of that idea of national sovereignty was electrified, mobilized, supercharged, because the world was becoming more interdependent across national borders, right? And it was that dependency and the competition across borders that, in a sense, gave new significance to the nation state. So the rise of the Japanese nation state in the 19th century was part of a worldwide phenomena that nationalism rose alongside and because of internationalism, because these societies were becoming more integrated. One might say that a very similar phenomenon is what happened after 1989. And that the nationalist response that we see by 2015, 2016 is itself a response to global integration. So the nation and the world have always been commingled. And when we tell our stories, one of the challenges is how to combine the two of them. But your question is about Eurocentrism. I mean, how do we tell stories about nations that don't repeat the same or impose the categories that were themselves brought from another place? I guess, so one pushback to you, Yuki, would be, while we want to overcome Eurocentrism in the same way that we want to overcome methodological nationalism, it does not mean that just as the nation is not irrelevant, in fact, the nation is very powerful and important, we have to understand it and explain it in global ways. The same applies to Eurocentrism. We need to explain Eurocentrism as a global phenomenon, right? That's how I would turn it around and say, Eurocentrism is something we have to transcend by making it the subject of our stories, right? How Europeans developed a sense of themselves at the center of the world and exported their categories to everybody else, right? So, I mean, there are different ways of doing it. We can go into that if you want, but that's how I would say Eurocentrism is interesting as a history of the cognitive models that Europeans develop of the world. And so for those who are not Europeans, they're always, and then having to see their own world through the categories that Europeans exported, they are, in a sense, trapped in categories that they themselves didn't make. But we could say the same about Europeans.
Right. So we always need to sort of like think from outside point of view as well, like outside and inside, and also the dialogue between the past and the present. Yes. So when we mention the past and present, we also have to consider the future. So are we really free from temporality, or if not, how can we write the history which will be relevant in 10 years or 20 years from now?
The world and the human society in 30 years, that is the main topic of this Tokyo College.
Well, yeah, because I think one might say that when we write stories about the past, we are actually scripting narratives that connect us to the future, right? You know, I think global history is relevant, if anything, more relevant now than ever. And because we live, this is a big generalization, and please criticize me if you think it's too big a generalization, but I think we are living in a narrative fog. By which I mean, I think we don't know which stories make sense of what we share and what divides us. In fact, the stories have themselves been weaponized, right? It's your narrative versus my narrative. It's the global versus the national, or my national narrative versus yours. And we become very aware that the stories, well, you know, Yuki, you study museums, public history is a very important process of this, creating identities and exclusions. And I think because we face monumental global challenges, climate change, the global migrant crisis, we could go down the list, we need to have capabilities of telling stories about our fragile togetherness. And I think that I say, you know, why global history is more relevant now, perhaps, than it was when we started to experiment with this new field, you know, 20 years ago.
I think it's
last question, Yuki, last question.
I think it's a really interesting point that you raised, because we are now living in a world with the shared problems, and we all aware, but we don't know how to reach consensus, and we don't know how to agree with each other. So to reflect what has been going on in the US and the whole world, I think we are aware about the polarization. So the divide is not just between the West and the rest, but it has been an issue within the society. So
global integration, by the way, does that, Yuki. I mean, it has always done this, that globalization integrates societies across borders, but it also creates new fractures and divides within them.
So you think the polarization is also probably the part of the global history. So I want to ask you the final question about what are the roles of global historians now.
That's a tough question, Yuki. I for my own self, this is just speaking for myself, because I'm not even sure that our little tribe of global historians, we would all agree on this one. But I think more and more in this fractured, delicate, but very importantly together world, we share a planet, and it's yet having a lot of common problems, I would say. One thing that I think we as global historians can do in our time is to help our students, our readers, our listeners, for people who are watching, think of themselves as learning and listening to others, to strangers in particular. And our skill sets of being able to understand other people's stories, don't have to agree with them, but to understand them, to know where they come from, to think about how they think about evidence, how they think about characters and plot and all the kinds of things that we think that make up our narratives, I think is a skill that's going to be very important for going forward. And we global historians, because we cross borders like this, should be talking more explicitly about that skill set for the world.
Well, thank you very much, both. very interesting discussion. That I want to view this video in 4 years. What we discussed at that moment, how we feel the discussion of this time. But anyway, we just let's keep talking, discussing, and communicating like this, and in person, of course. And we are very happy to invite you to Tokyo in the very near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, both of you. I miss you both, either here in Princeton or in Tokyo soon, I hope. Bye-bye.
Thank you.